James was a man of few words. He lived alone in a small cottage near the cliffs, where the crashing waves were the only sound he heard most nights. The villagers knew him as a simple fisherman, always quiet, always kind. His only companion was Mayao, a stray cat he had rescued years ago. Mayao was more than a pet, he was family. The villagers often joked that James and his cat were inseparable, two souls bound by an invisible thread. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, James sat on his porch repairing an old fishing net. The air was cool, the scent of salt lingering from the ocean. Meow lay at his feet, purring softly. Everything was peaceful until James noticed a faint glow in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the moon reflecting on the water, but then he smelled it. Smoke. The glow grew brighter, and soon the unmistakable crackle of fire reached his ears. It was coming from the village. James grabbed his coat and hurried toward the source, his heart pounding. Meow, sensing the urgency, followed close behind. As he approached, the scene before him made his stomach drop. The village armazém, the warehouse where the community stored food and supplies, was engulfed in flames. Villagers were everywhere, shouting and running. Some tried to form a bucket line, while others screamed for help. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bucket and joined the effort, his hands trembling as he threw water at the roaring fire. The heat was intense, and the smell of burning wood and smoke was suffocating. Despite their efforts, the fire raged on, destroying everything in its path. By the time the flames were finally out, the armazém was nothing but ash and rubble. 3 villagers were confirmed dead, and the community was in shock. James stood silently among the crowd, his face streaked with soot. Meow meowed at his feet, rubbing against his leg as if to comfort him. No one spoke to James. Their faces were full of fear and sorrow. The next morning, whispers spread through the village like wildfire. Who had caused the tragedy? Some said it was an accident, but others were not so sure. Then came the shocking accusation. A young boy claimed he had seen James near the armazém that night, carrying something that looked like a torch. The boy's trembling voice was enough to convince many. The kind fisherman was suddenly the center of suspicion. The village square buzzed with whispers the morning after the fire. Groups of villagers gathered near the charred remains of the armazém, their faces etched with grief and unease. The boy's claim had spread like wildfire, turning suspicion into certainty for many. "I saw him," the boy repeated to anyone who would listen. His voice trembled as he clutched his mother's hand. James was there. He had something in his hand, and then the fire started. "Why would James do this?" asked one woman, her arms crossed as she stared at the ruined warehouse. "He's lived here his whole life. What could he gain?" "Sometimes quiet men have the darkest secrets," replied a gray-haired farmer, shaking his head. "You think you know someone, but you don't." James sat alone in his cottage, staring at the floor. The boy's words echoed in his mind, louder than the sound of the waves crashing outside. He hadn't been near the armazém that night, and yet the villagers seemed ready to believe he was guilty. Why? Was it because he kept to himself? Because he lived on the outskirts of the village? His heart ached at the thought of being mistrusted by the people he had called neighbors for decades. Meow jumped onto his lap, nuzzling his face into James's chest. "What do we do now, Meow?" James whispered, stroking the cat's soft fur. "They think I did it. They think I'm a monster." The thought of being blamed for the deaths of 3 innocent people made his chest tighten. He tried to replay the events of that night in his head, searching for anything that might prove his innocence. Meanwhile, Father Elias gathered a small group of villagers near the church. "We cannot rush to judgment," he said, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "James has been a part of this community for years. He deserves a fair hearing." "But the boy saw him," argued a middle-aged man. "And if James is guilty, we need to act before he does something worse." "We don't know the full story," Elias replied firmly. "Jumping to conclusions will only divide us further. Let us find evidence before we accuse an innocent man." His words silenced some, but not all. Suspicion lingered in the air, thick and heavy. That afternoon, 2 constables arrived at James's home. They knocked firmly on the door, startling both James and Meow. "James, we need to talk," one of them said. Their tone was not unkind, but it carried an air of authority that left no room for refusal. James opened the door cautiously. "What is this about?" though he already knew the answer. "We need you to come with us to the square," the second constable said. "The villagers have questions, and it's best if we address this now." Reluctantly, James nodded. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, Maya following close behind. The walk to the village square felt endless. James could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of fear, anger, and pity. When they arrived, a crowd had already gathered. The boy who had accused James stood at the front, holding tightly to his mother's hand. His small face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between James and the constables. "James," Father Elias began, stepping forward, "we've heard troubling claims about your presence near the armazém last night. Do you have anything to say?" James took a deep breath. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice steady but quiet. I was at home, mending my fishing nets. I saw the fire and ran to help, like everyone else. That's not what the boy says, someone called from the crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the villagers. James turned to the boy, his expression pained. Son, he said gently, why are you saying this? I've never done anything to hurt you or anyone else in this village. The boy looked down, his grip on his mother's hand tightening. I saw you, he mumbled. I swear I saw you. A man in the crowd stepped forward, his fists clenched. You're lying, James, he shouted. You've always kept to yourself, always acting like you're better than the rest of us. Maybe you thought burning down the Armazem would teach us a lesson. I would never. James started, but his words were drowned out by the growing noise of the crowd. Enough, Father Elias shouted, raising his hands. The crowd fell silent, though their tension remained palpable. We cannot condemn a man without evidence. Let the constables investigate. Until then, James remains in their custody for his own safety. James felt the world spin around him as the constables took him by the arms and led him away. He didn't resist. There was no point. Meow followed as far as he could until a guard kicked at the cat, sending him scurrying into the shadows. As the cell door closed behind him, James sank onto the hard bench and buried his face in his hands. The whispers of the villagers, the frightened look on the boy's face, and the anger in the man's voice replayed over and over in his mind. Alone in the dim light, he whispered, Why me? Why now? Far from the prison, Meow slinked back toward the ruins of the Armazam, his tail flicking with determination. The villagers might have turned against James, but Meow hadn't. The loyal cat prowled through the ashes, his nose twitching as he searched for something only he seemed to understand. James sat in the dim cell, the air thick with dampness and despair. The faint light from the barred window cast long shadows on the stone walls, mirroring the darkness in his heart. He replayed the accusations in his mind, trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. The boy's trembling voice, the accusing stares of the villagers, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal weighed heavily on him. He had always lived a quiet, honest life. How could they believe he was capable of such destruction? The constables visited him the next morning, their faces unreadable. James, one of them said, standing just outside the cell, we need to know if you have any enemies, anyone who might want to frame you for this. James leaned back against the cold wall and sighed. I've never hurt anyone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've lived my life on the sea, providing for myself and keeping to myself. If someone hates me, I wouldn't know why. His thoughts wandered to the boy who had accused him. Was the child mistaken, or was there something more sinister at play? Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the village remained on edge. Some believed in James's innocence, while others were convinced of his guilt. Father Elias, determined to uncover the truth, began speaking with the villagers one by one. Do you remember seeing anyone else near the Armazem that night? He asked repeatedly. Many shrugged or shook their heads, unwilling or unable to provide any new information. One villager, however, hesitated. It was the gray-haired farmer who had been so quick to doubt James. I didn't want to say anything before, he admitted, lowering his voice, but I thought I saw someone else near the Armazem before the fire started. It wasn't James, it was someone taller, wearing a cloak, but I can't be sure. As Father Elias pondered the farmer's words, Meow prowled the village unnoticed. The clever cat had returned to the ruins of the Armazam, sniffing through the ashes with an intensity that suggested purpose. His sharp eyes caught something glinting beneath a pile of charred wood. Pawing at it, Meow uncovered a small, scorched piece of cloth with faint initials embroidered in one corner. Though the letters were hard to read, Meow knew this discovery could change everything. Father Elias held the farmer's words close to his heart as he walked through the village, his thoughts churning. A cloaked figure? Why hadn't anyone else mentioned this? His steps led him to the charred ruins of the Armazam, where he stood for a long time, staring at the blackened debris. The air was still heavy with the acrid smell of smoke, and the silence around the ruins seemed to pulse with secrets untold. If James didn't do this, he murmured to himself, then someone else is walking free. While Elias pondered the mystery, Meow emerged from the shadows, carrying the small piece of scorched cloth in his mouth. The cat padded silently toward the priest, stopping just short of his feet. Startled, Elias looked down to find Meow staring up at him with an intensity that was almost human. What have you found, little one? Elias asked, crouching down to take the cloth. The initials embroidered on the fabric were faint but visible. H.T. Elias frowned. The only person in the village with those initials was Harold Thomas, a wealthy merchant who often kept to himself. Harold had always been a man of influence, his wealth shielding him from scrutiny. The priest hesitated. Was it possible that Harold had something to do with the fire? If so, why? Meow meowed loudly, as if urging Elias to act. You may be onto something, Elias said, patting the cat's head. He slipped the cloth into his pocket and decided to confront Harold. As he walked toward the merchant's home, his mind raced with possibilities. Harold rarely interacted with the villagers, but his presence at town meetings was always marked by a sense of authority. Did he have a motive for such destruction? Harold's house was grand compared to the modest homes in the village. Elias knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, Harold opened it, his expression guarded. "Father Elias," he said, his voice smooth but distant, "what brings you here?" "I've come to ask a few questions," Elias said, holding Harold's gaze. "About the fire." Harold's brows furrowed. "I've already told the constables everything I know," he replied, stepping aside to let the priest in. "But if you have more questions, I'll answer them." Inside, the house was impeccably clean, almost too clean. Elias noticed Harold's hands trembling slightly as he poured tea for them. "Do you recall where you were the night of the fire?" Elias asked, watching Harold closely. "I was at home," Harold said quickly, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Alone. I only heard about the fire when the bells rang." "And these initials," Elias said, pulling out the cloth, "do they mean anything to you?" Harold's face paled. He reached for the cloth but stopped himself. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "A friend," Elias replied, choosing his words carefully. "It was found among the ruins of the Armazém. Care to explain how it got there?" Harold stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know what you're implying, Father," he snapped, "but I had nothing to do with that fire." His sudden defensiveness only deepened Elias's suspicions. Back at the prison, James sat on the cold bench, unaware of the discoveries unfolding outside. He ran his hands through his hair, thinking of Miao. "You're smarter than all of them," he muttered to himself. "I just hope you're safe out there." Little did he know, his loyal companion had already taken the first step toward uncovering the truth. As night fell over the village, Father Elias couldn't shake the image of Harold's pale face and trembling hands. Something about the merchant's reaction felt off. Why had he been so defensive? And why had the cloth with his initials been at the scene of the fire? Elias decided it was too dangerous to confront Harold further without gathering more evidence. The priest returned to his small chapel, where he lit a candle and sat in silence, deep in thought. Meanwhile, Miao continued his search, his instincts guiding him through the narrow alleys and quiet streets of the village. The clever cat stopped outside Harold's home, sniffing the air. Something about the house seemed strange. He prowled around the perimeter until he found an open window. With a graceful leap, he slipped inside. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of papers rustling in the study. Harold was sitting at his desk, going through stacks of documents. His face was tense, his eyes darting to the window every so often. Miao crouched in the shadows, watching silently. On the desk lay a map of the village with several locations marked in red. The Armazém was one of them. Beside the map was a ledger, its pages filled with transactions and names. Miao's sharp eyes caught a peculiar entry, a payment made to an unknown individual just days before the fire. As Harold turned to pour himself a drink, Miao crept closer. With a quick swipe of his paw, he knocked the ledger to the floor. Harold spun around, startled. "What the?" he muttered, bending down to pick up the book. But when he looked up, the cat was already gone, slipping back out the window into the night. The next morning, Father Elias woke to find Miao waiting outside the chapel, the ledger clutched in his jaws. "You've been busy," Elias said with a smile, taking the book. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he read the suspicious entry. "This could be the proof we need," he whispered. Elias decided to visit the constables, bringing the ledger and the piece of cloth as evidence. The head constable, a stern man named Gregory, listened carefully as Elias laid out his findings. "This doesn't prove Harold started the fire," Gregory said cautiously, "but it does raise questions. We'll need to investigate further." As the constables prepared to confront Harold, news of the new evidence spread through the village. Some villagers were relieved, hoping this would clear James's name. Others were skeptical, unwilling to believe that someone as influential as Harold could be involved. Tensions rose, and whispers of conspiracy filled the air. At the prison, James was startled when a constable appeared at his cell door. "James," he said, unlocking the door, "you're coming with me." "Why? What's going on?" James asked, his heart pounding. "We've found something that might prove your innocence," the constable replied, "but we need you to confirm a few things." James followed the constable to the village square, where a crowd had gathered. At the center stood Father Elias, holding the ledger and the cloth. Harold was there too, his face a mask of anger and fear. "This is ridiculous," Harold shouted. "You have no real proof." "Perhaps not yet," Elias said calmly, "but the truth has a way of coming to light." The villagers watched in silence as the constables began to question Harold. James stood on the sidelines, his heart heavy with a mix of hope and dread. Could this finally be the moment where everything was made right? The atmosphere in the village square was thick with tension as the questioning of Harold began. Constable Gregory held the ledger in one hand, flipping through its pages with deliberate slowness. The villagers stood in hushed anticipation, their eyes darting between Harold and James. For James, this was a moment he had scarcely dared to hope for, a sliver of light piercing through the darkness of his unjust imprisonment. Harold Thomas, Gregory began, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Can you explain this entry? He pointed to the suspicious payment noted in the ledger. It's dated just days before the fire, and the recipient's name is conveniently missing. Harold's face remained calm, but his hands betrayed him, clenching tightly at his sides. That payment was for personal business, he said, his voice measured. It has nothing to do with the fire. And the initials on this piece of cloth, Elias interjected. And the initials on this piece of cloth, Father Elias interjected, holding up the scorched fabric. It was found among the ruins of the Armazame. Care to explain how it got there? Harold's calm facade cracked for a brief moment. He hesitated, then scoffed. You're grasping at straws, Father. That cloth could belong to anyone. It proves nothing. The crowd murmured in response, doubt creeping into their minds. But Gregory wasn't done. We've also spoken to witnesses, he said. One villager saw a cloaked figure near the Armazame on the night of the fire. They couldn't identify the person, but the description matches someone of your stature. Harold's composure began to unravel. This is absurd, he snapped, his voice rising. You have no concrete evidence, just vague accusations and coincidences. Suddenly, a voice broke through the crowd. It was the gray-haired farmer who had spoken to Elias earlier. I saw him that night, the farmer shouted, stepping forward. It was Harold. He was near the Armazame, and he was carrying something. A lantern, I think. I didn't want to say anything before, but now I'm certain. The villagers gasped, and all eyes turned to Harold, his face drained of color. This is a lie, he bellowed, but his voice trembled. You're trying to frame me. Before Harold could say more, Meow appeared, weaving through the crowd with a purpose. The cat stopped at Harold's feet and let out a loud, piercing meow. In his mouth, he held another scrap of fabric, a perfect match to the first, with the same initials embroidered on it. The villagers stared in disbelief as Elias picked up the new evidence. Even your own home holds the truth, Harold, Elias said, his voice steady but firm. Meow found this near your study. You've been hiding something, and it's time to come clean. Cornered and out of excuses, Harold's shoulders slumped. He looked around, his gaze meeting the faces of the villagers he had deceived. Fine, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Yes, I was there that night, but I didn't mean for things to go this far. What do you mean? Gregory demanded, stepping closer. I wanted to destroy the Armazame, Harold confessed, his voice shaking. The owner refused to sell it to me, and I needed that land for my expansion plans. I thought if the building was gone, I could buy the property at a lower price. I paid someone to set the fire, but I didn't know people were inside. I swear. The crowd erupted in anger and disbelief. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with a deep sadness. Lives had been lost, and his own had been shattered because of Harold's greed. Gregory ordered Harold to be taken into custody, and the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Father Elias placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. The truth always prevails, James, he said softly. Meow brushed against James's leg, purring loudly. James crouched down and scooped the cat into his arms. You did it, Meow, he said with a faint smile. You brought the truth to light. As the village began to heal, James was released from prison, his name cleared at last. But the scars of the past lingered, a reminder of the darkness that greed and deception could bring. James returned to his quiet life by the sea, with Meow always by his side, a loyal companion who had proven that even in the face of despair, justice could prevail.